Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish Prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Midweek Scottish Prism. I hope you and yours are well. As you know, this Midweek Prism, we like to be different from our weekend show, which seems sort of specialises on what's happening in Westminster and at Holyrood. But we like to cover different topics here that are still relevant to us all in Scotland, but not strictly political. And tonight's a non-political, or all political, if you like. It's all parties covered in this one. We're going to be discussing legal aid. And the justice system, and it's something that every country, every worthwhile country, requires is a good, solid justice system. And perhaps, well, we'll find out tonight, but perhaps it's not quite as good as some would like to think it is. It's maybe not getting the attention it deserves. But to help me do that, of course, as I always say every other Sunday, I'll introduce our favourite lawyer in Clackmannan is, of course, Eva Comrie. Eva, a different role tonight. You're here as more as a family lawyer.
Yes, and very much looking forward to hearing from your other two contributors who are really very much at the top of their game in their respective fields. So I think this will be a robust, and I hope for your viewers, a very interesting, thought-provoking discussion.
Nothing but the best on here, Eva. That's nothing but the best. And one of those, of course, is Ian Moir. He's a partner in a multi-award-winning firm, Moir Sweeney Litigation, and also convener of Criminal Legal Aid Committee of the Law Society of Scotland. Did I get that right, Ian?
Yep, spot on.
Welcome.
Good evening.
Welcome, and thank you for participating tonight. We're really looking forward to your input.
Yep, I'm looking forward to taking part.
Good. And our other guest is Roddy Dunlop, KC, the Dean of Faculty of the Advocates, a silk since 2010. In fact, the only silk in Scotland to be ranked in the 7 separate practice areas by Chambers UK. Welcome, Roddy Dunlop. Well, nice to see you here.
And you, Roddy, thanks very much for inviting me on.
All the best people are called Roddy, of course.
Indeed.
Just a fact. So what, as I said right at the beginning, is we're talking here about legal aid. And there's a lot of things been coming up recently. And Eva, you've been asking me to have a wee show about this. Now, legal aid, we all know what it is. Can you explain just slightly how it interacts with your everyday work?
Well, legal aid is about the government providing money to pay legal expenses for those worthy cases who deserve representation but are financially unable to pay that or pay the full cost of it themselves. So I don't do criminal legal aid anymore. I stopped doing criminal work 20 odd years ago, but I still do civil legal aid, especially in relation to family disputes, and children's legal aid, which generally relates to the appearance before children's hearings or children's panels, as folk might refer to them, and referrals from the panel to the sheriff. So a lot of my work is to do with family breakdown, family disputes, difficulties that might arise from health issues. Perhaps there might be questions of neglect or difficulties concerning maybe allegations that children have been assaulted or not looked after properly. Or there may be disputes that surround family breakdowns and arguments between relatives where the state is not involved, but where parents or carers are not able to agree things like residence and contact arrangements, or whether a child is able to relocate to a different part of the country. So very much the bread and butter of my practice are these aspects which really affect the day-to-day lives of a tremendous amount of people. And because I work in Clackmannanshire, Stirling and Falkirk primarily, there are very many people in the area that in theory are eligible for legal aid, but that's not to say that they're always able to get that service for reasons that I'm sure we'll come on to shortly.
Excellent. That sounds quite straightforward. I don't know why we're having a wee chat about it, because it sounds as if it works great. But you're going to tell me there are some things that are not quite working just now, is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that aren't working very well, to be honest. My firm do civil legal aid, or did civil legal aid, but have, to a large measure, stopped taking on new cases. We simply cannot make ends meet in the civil legal aid field. We're one of the bigger providers of criminal legal aid and regularly appear in courts up and down the whole length and breadth of Scotland. And we are seeing that there are fewer and fewer solicitors in the more rural courts, and those that are there are not specialising in criminal law because there isn't enough of it to justify specialising in it. So you need people with experience to come and run jury trials in places like Campbelltown, Kirkwall, etc. And a number of years ago, the government cut the travel rate in half. So it's uneconomic for us to get to these places, but it's essential that we do. And increasingly people are saying we'll just stay in the central belt and not assist in these courts. So it's becoming a major problem for people in the Highlands to get representation even in criminal work.
Yeah, I also heard, Roddy, that one of the other things that's a problem, and tell me if I'm wrong, is that the prosecuting services are paying much higher salaries and starting money to new lawyers. So they're being taken into the prosecution side of law, and there's not as many. Therefore, there's not as many going into the defence side. Would that be a fair assessment?
It is, absolutely, and you can't blame the Crown Office for wanting to attract people to it. That's fair enough, but there needs to be a countervailing balance to all of this. Your starting salary for a trainee, people often think, well, lawyers, it's fat cats, endless wealth, etc. You're talking about a starting salary for a trainee in a legal aid firm, probably about £25,000. If you set that against what the Public Defender's Solicitor's Office are offering, their starting one is 31,000. If you go into Crown Office, it can be higher. You're talking orders of magnitude higher for commercial firms. And so it's not really very attractive. They're not making it attractive for people to come in. Now, there was a change, for 1 year there was a change in 2021 when Hamza Yousaf, then the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, introduced the traineeship fund. And that encouraged 40 new trainees, enabled 40 new trainee positions in criminal firms. That brought instant results. And we are seeing that. If you look at the figures now, those people have stayed in criminal work, but it was 1 year only. It hasn't happened since. And we're not getting the people coming in at the bottom end to work their way up. If you start your traineeship in a civil firm, in a commercial firm, you're not going to go into criminal work. You'll stay in civil work. So we need to attract more graduates into legal aid defence at the solicitor's end of things in order to replace the huge swathes of people we're losing at the top end. You look at the figures, in the last 4 years, we lost 174 legal aid practitioners retiring or leaving legal aid work at the top end, only replaced by 55. If that continues, we are going to have, we've already got a problem. If it continues, we're going to have a massive problem.
Now, is this one of the problems, Eva, that, I mean, for example, never mind the colour of the government, but if governments are seen to be giving money as, putting in ensuite showers and flat screen tellies in prisons, or we're giving extra money to defend criminals, that gets the right-wing press going and it gets the letters going into the letters page. Is that because there's a perception of we shouldn't really be helping here? That sort of predicament.
Well, I think we have to distinguish between criminal, civil and children's legal aid. And in the context of criminal legal aid, it's simply stated a mark of a democratic society and of an egalitarian society if access to justice is not based only on the individual's financial position. So money has to be paid to ensure fair and equal representation before the law. It's just a very simple tenet of basic justice. But if you look at the bigger picture in a more detailed fashion, it's much better for society at large, and in that I include the general public who might be witnesses or members of the jury. It's better for police, it's better for the judiciary system generally, if as many people as possible are actually legally represented, because it streamlines a process. And there are obviously circumstances which I know Ian in particular would be able to address in far greater detail and with more knowledge than I can, about instances where the accused is not allowed to cross-examine some witnesses. But so that criminal side of things would stand alone, and Ian would speak in that about detail. From my perspective, though, in civil and children's work, I've often been involved in cases where they work better and you get a better result across the board, particularly for the children concerned, where the adults who are arguing about the arrangements for their care are legally represented. And I'll give you an example. I had a series of cases that ran about 12, 14 years ago, which involved the obtaining from a local authority of several thousands of pages of social work case notes. By no stretch of the imagination would my client have been able to recover those notes, read them, understand them, condense them, and find what I discovered. And what I discovered was subsequently written up by the sheriff and established in court beyond any shadow of a doubt that some of the case notes had been fabricated by certain workers and that they contained mistruths, and that the workers who had given evidence had actually and deliberately misled a series of children's hearings and had given false evidence to the court. Now, by no stretch of the imagination could my client have dealt with any of that on her own. It was difficult enough for me to condense and understand everything that had gone on. And these are cases that are complex, and you're talking about situations where you might have complex evidence like that I've just mentioned. You might have very harrowing circumstances, and you might have a client who is intellectually challenged, who might have cognitive difficulties, who might have health problems, all of which militate against them being able to make a good account of themselves and do justice to themselves. And it's better for society and for all those involved in the process if you've got professionals there who are able to look at things dispassionately, or as dispassionately as possible, and present a case to a court which is as succinct as it can possibly be, and where pleadings are accurate and not subject to the difficulties that will arise if you're dealing with lay people who really don't know the ropes and don't have anybody to tell them if they can't afford a lawyer and legal aid's not available for them. That maybe applies particularly so if your child, for example, is either in care or you're being threatened with your child being removed and put into care, and you really do need a lawyer to represent your interests before the children's hearing or before the sheriff, because once a child is removed into care, it can be extremely difficult for parents to prove that they've been able to be rehabilitated to the extent where children can come home again. So the consequences of decisions like those are enormous and are life-altering for the people involved.
Ian, a great phrase, I believe it. Life is simple, it's people that make it complicated. I mean, if tomorrow, by some miracle, I became the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Justice, and I call you up, Ian, and say, if I just write a cheque today, Ian, for X, whatever, would that solve the majority of the problems in the legal aid system?
No. We've got to the stage now where for many years universities have been actively discouraging law students from even looking at criminal law and legal aid work. As Roddy rightly identified, we were able to persuade the government to launch a trainee fund 3 years ago, but that would only really work if they do that every year for a number of years, and if the conditions and the money that's available allow for less stressful and antisocial working conditions than we can provide. The phone goes literally from, well, it can go all night, frankly, but certainly from before you head off for court, you'll, on an average day, probably have dealt with 5 or 6 clients on the phone. Then you go to court, you're there all day, maybe doing trials, solemn work, difficult, complicated appearances for people coming from custody who are maybe experiencing the effects of several days on drugs, and they're now coming down from that because they're in custody. They can be volatile, difficult to deal with. Then you have to go back to the office, see clients. Then you might get home for your dinner if you're lucky before the phone starts ringing again all evening. And then you can't rule out that the police will phone and you'll have to attend most of the night for a police interview. That's not attractive to lawyers when they can go and work for the Crown for more money, where they're not asked to do that, or if they're working for the Legal Aid Board either through the contact line or the Public Defender's Office, if they have to go and do that, they will then get a day off in lieu to make up for it. We don't have that luxury. You're straight back into court the next day. You can't turn around and say, I'm not going to conduct that jury trial because I was doing a rape interview till 11 p.m. last night. So it's not as simple as throwing money at it. But if they don't throw money at it now, there will be even less people left to do this. It's very disheartening when those that are left are struggling their best to get things to work in the court, despite, for example, GOAME constantly not bringing people to court in time. You can be stuck for the entire day waiting for somebody to be brought to certain courts that aren't as busy and won't be prioritised, for which you're paid absolutely nothing, and it completely destroys destroys the rest of your diary. And as you battle through all of that, to then be in a position where when you try and tell them how bad it's getting, you're ignored. And in order to fix the problems that other departments within the court have, they just put yet more burdens on us with new protocols that involve us preparing even earlier for cases, which is simply impossible. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that people are leaving because they can't cope with the additional burden that we're facing, and we don't have the resource to meet those new criteria. We're always willing to discuss and try and improve things and help make the system work better. But to be constantly told there's no evidence when we're used to dealing with evidence being people who are actually involved in the thing telling you what's happening, they won't listen to us. They just look at stats and say, there's no evidence that there's a problem. But there is a problem, because those people that are left are heading for retirement age or are so burnt out that they want out whether they can afford to retire or not. I know one lawyer who left at the end of the practice year there who isn't in a financial position to do so, but simply couldn't tolerate the job anymore. So it's a real major issue, and they can't say they haven't been warned, because we've been telling them this for years.
Rod, is one of the problems that the legal profession, are talking to civil servants who don't have a legal background and don't understand the problems that Ian's highlighting there, all the extra things that have to be done? Is that a problem?
Well, if it is, it's a surprising one, because as Ian has been saying, we have been warning of this for a long time. And when I say we, it is the legal profession as a whole. And I should stress that whenever I speak on this issue, I'm always aware that there's the risk of it being seen as self-pleading. Oh, lawyer asked for more money. How surprising is that? Can I make it absolutely clear to your listeners? The only interest I have in this is from a point of view of access to justice, because I make no complaint about the legal aid system insofar as it applies to counsel, i.e. members of the Faculty of Advocates, the body I represent. Is legal aid perfect for counsel? No, it's not. Do we suggest that we don't get paid enough under legal aid? No, I don't. I don't say that. The problem lies exclusively, or almost exclusively, in what is provided for the solicitor side of the profession. And it's that side of the profession that needs to be looked at. So I'm speaking on this issue with absolutely no skin in the game, other than from the point of view of access to justice. Now, Ian's right to say money isn't going to solve everything, but money is the universal solvent after all. And the first thing that needs to be done is to put money into the system. And it should be a no-brainer from the government's point of view, because it's well recognised that the legal profession is one of the few things you can invest in, and you will get money back. You will get money back with ease. Recent figures suggest for every £1 spent in legal aid, you get £8.32 back in social value. That is a no-brainer. Why are we not investing in that system? Scotland has had a legal profession it could be proud of for centuries. Since the College of Justice Act 1532, we have championed access to justice. Long before legal aid was invented, we had what was called the poor roll, in which members of faculty would do cases for the poor that couldn't afford it for nothing. So when it's often said the poor had no lawyers, actually in Scotland, the poor has almost always had their lawyers. Donoghue against Stevenson, Mrs. Donoghue was on the poor roll. She was represented all the way to the House of Lords without any fee. And that we're at real risk now. We're at real risk of creating a situation where the poor will have no lawyers because you're not getting access to the necessary representation, and because people are leaving in droves. And going back to your point about, well, it is part of the problem here, well, nobody likes giving money to criminals. Well, on criminal law, let's start with the presumption of innocence, and what Eva says, it's a basic tenet of any democratic society that everyone is entitled to proper representation. Well, let's then also factor in what else is in play. Eva's specialist area, children's hearings, children's panels, appeals to the sheriff. These are difficult, complex, anxious cases that people need legal aid, people need proper representation for. Domestic abuse cases, situations where the police have done, let's say they've done what they can to protect somebody, but it's not enough. They need a civil restraint order or a non-harassment order, an interim interdict. You need access to legal representation to get that, because you can't just wander in and fill out a small claim, tick the following boxes if you want these orders. They're complicated. We need to resource this properly, otherwise society as a whole will suffer.
Even so, if we did throw some money at it, some of the points that Ian backed up, I mean, you were talking about that document you read, but if you were getting more money from legal aid and would it be better, you could then afford to hire another lawyer and encourage someone into the profession if the salaries were better, and they could be doing a lot by learning, they could be doing a lot of that donkey work for you, for want of a better phrase.
Well, back in the 80s and 90s, I worked in firms where we had multiple staff members per partner or per fee earner, so that, there was a period of time I was in an office, in a firm that had 4 offices, 4 partners, and we had probably a couple of dozen members of staff who were not lawyers, who were support staff. In the main, in rural areas like Clackmannanshire, where I am, these days are gone, and there are very few support staff able to be employed. That's partly because of improvements in IT, but it's also because of the squeeze on lawyers who have to do far more for themselves that support staff they're no longer able to afford to pay. But in the context of employing a lawyer or a trainee, when I started work in the 80s, I think for a while I was probably the only trainee in Clackmannanshire, and I think there would be 1 or 2 in Stirling. I was certainly the only female for a good deal of that time in both places, certainly in terms of attending court on a regular basis. Where we've got to now in Clackmannanshire is that there are today, in the whole of Clackmannanshire, population of about 52,500, we've got 3 lawyers who can do children's panel cases on legal aid. But those 3 lawyers will not always be available for each case because there will be conflicts of interest. There will be cases that require multiple people to be involved. And all the time, literally every single day, all the legal aid lawyers I know in Clackmannanshire and beyond are taking calls from people from throughout the country because they cannot find a legal aid lawyer, because people are not being trained to take over from the likes of me. So if the money was available, I would love to be able to train a trainee and teach them what I know. As it stands at present, I'll be retiring in a few years and my knowledge and experience will go with me. It'll walk right out the door. And I don't, given the way that things are currently developing, I don't have any optimism that the government will listen, the government of any colour politically will listen and actually fully fund a proper, comprehensive civil and children's legal aid service, because they're certainly not doing it now. It's especially a problem for domestic abuse cases, as Roddy has said, but also in respect of separations where there might be money or property involved, because it's often the case that people can have very low incomes but be asset rich and maybe have a house, maybe have pension interests that are worth a lot of money. So folk like me are not going to take those cases on under legal aid, where much of the work that we do is actually unpaid and where sometimes the hourly rate is lower than the amount of our hourly overhead. So there are many people now who have financial and property claims arising on a separation who have to represent themselves because they can't afford to pay a lawyer and they cannot find one to do the case on legal aid. Because, whether I take on a legal aid client or a private client, My overheads are still the same. I've still got to pay my professional indemnity insurance, which of course we should have, but you have to think about the cost of the overhead when you then look at what you've got coming in. And as it is just now, most mixed practices like mine, where we still do some legal aid, rely to a huge extent on private clients who in effect subsidise legal aid clients. And it shouldn't be that way. We should be in a position that legal aid work is profitable. It doesn't have to be hugely profitable, but it should wash its face plus a bit more. I'll give you a couple of examples of where it doesn't wash its face. A few months ago, I did a will for a lady on advice and assistance, which is non-court legal aid. So a telephone call, 2 meetings and a will drafted, signed, completed, and client went away happy with her will, and I kept a copy. My total fee paid by the Legal Aid Board was £32. What was the point in me doing that? It cost me a lot more money to do that job than I ever made out of it. I had another one recently, a girl who was really concerned because a young mother, baby about to be born. I spoke to her before the birth, spoke to her after the birth, 2 very lengthy conversations, which took a fair amount of my time. And the Legal Aid Board will pay me, if they pay me my full rate, £28 for that whole file from start to finish. That's what you're talking about. Now, these cases are not atypical. That sort of thing happens often, but that's where we've got to. On fixed rate civil legal aid fees for, say, a residence contact action, we get paid by block. So you don't get paid for correspondence, you don't get paid for meetings with clients. There is a whole amount of work that you do if you want to do a job properly that is not factored into the block fee element at all. And that's why so many solicitors are stopping doing legal aid cases on residence and contact, because it's hard work, it's intense if you do it properly, and it ends up not being profitable unless you're lucky enough to represent one of the parties who's paying you privately, and you can take all the time in the world to do a good job knowing that you're getting paid for it.
That was one of the lawyers I was talking to earlier today, getting a wee bit of research on, said, there's only been about 2 rises in legal aid money, Ian, in the last 20 odd years. That it's been that bad.
Right. And there were cuts made about 12, 14 years ago, some of which still haven't been reversed. They were supposed to be short-term austerity measures, including the half travel that I mentioned earlier. So the position's pretty bleak, to be honest, because even the most significant rise that we got a couple of years ago of 10%, by the time they actually put that into effect, inflation was running at higher than 10%. So we're actually still further behind than we were when even the government accepted that something had to be done. There needs to be very significant investment right now to shore up the firms and the practitioners that are still here, and then investment in trainee funds and things like that to allow us going forward to continue to offer jobs to people to come into this area. Because another concern that I have raised many times with them is that as people with experience and ability go off to become sheriffs or prosecutors in the High Court or work for the Scottish Government, any of these jobs that are far more attractive than the situation that we're facing, where your rents are rising by almost 50%. You've got national insurance to deal with. If you've got a number of staff, as I do, that's going to cost me many thousands of pounds that I just have to find from such profit as I make, and make it so. But how can we have confidence that in 10 years' time, maybe even less, that there are people with that ability and experience to go and become the sheriffs that we need, the judges that we need, the KCs that we need? If it's constantly dumbed down and done to a lesser and lesser standard because it's impossible, because you don't have the resource, that's in nobody's interest, because you have to have not just a strong defence bar, but they feed into the judiciary and all of these other key jobs that help the justice system to function and function effectively. So it's not as simple as saying oh, who cares if there's 700 criminal defence lawyers or 800? If there are not enough people coming in to then gain experience and stay, then we've got a massive, massive problem coming down the line. I advertised for another lawyer recently and was willing to take really any level of experience. I had one applicant who was a trainee at another firm. No qualified lawyers interested in coming and working for a busy firm with lots of interesting cases. And it's nothing to do with our individual firm. It's to do with people want to go off and do something less demanding that will pay miles better. It's not rocket science that people would rather have a less stressful and difficult job and be paid more. That's natural. I'll give you an example. I do work in Orkney and have gone there for many years for legal aid and private clients. And when I was going there regularly, say about 10 years ago, there were half a dozen criminal registered legal aid lawyers, all very experienced, able lawyers. There are now none.
Yeah.
There's only one lawyer on Orkney doing defence work, and that is a solicitor employed by the Public Defender's Office. And they cannot represent you if you just fall the wrong side of qualifying for legal aid. So you may miss out by literally a matter of pounds to qualify for what's called ABWAR, assistance by way of representation, if you want to plead guilty. That's a sort of straight line. You either qualify or you don't. You could miss out by £5 on qualifying for that and then have to represent yourself because you don't have the hundreds of pounds to fly a lawyer up from the Central Belt to even cover the outlays, let alone their fees. So there's a major problem there. There's one civil legal aid lawyer left in Orkney serving about 30,000 people.
Yeah.
And there are no civil legal aid lawyers in Shetland. And the one criminal legal aid lawyer there is at or around retirement age. So these are real life problems for a lot of people. This isn't a theory that could happen. It's already happened in those areas. And we're now seeing civil legal aid deserts in the East End of Glasgow. I mean, if you can't make it work there, you can't make it work. So we need evidence. We need evidence. They've got the evidence. They're hearing it from the people who are stopping doing the work because they're fed up losing money by trying to prop the system up.
Roddy, if you get the power tomorrow, you were given the power, what would you do to sort this out?
Well, I would reinstate the traineeship fund immediately, and I would make sure that was in place. Look, it's £1 million, right? £1 million, you think, well, that's a lot of money, but £1 million in the grand scheme of the Scottish budget is, a drop.
Yeah.
So I would put that in place, and so I'd reinstate that to get the traineeships back in and get people into the criminal business. I would have an overhaul of the legal aid system and review and raise the rates in consultation with the profession in order to allow the criminal legal aid firms to, as Eva says, to wash their face. We're not talking about making millions of pounds of profit here. We're talking about allowing them to run a business that washes its face, makes a modest profit so that people can actually be encouraged to stay in the business. And if we did that, then we might be able to start redressing it. I share Ian's pessimism that we are so far down the line that it's difficult to see that we don't have a massive problem coming. He's mentioned Kirkwall. There's no legal aid solicitor in Lochmaddy. There's one legal aid solicitor for the whole of Fort William. There's two for the whole of Alloa. It's getting ridiculous. And as Ian says, the suggestion that is repeatedly thrown at us saying, well, actually, if you look at the data, it's not that bad. It is that bad. You only need to look. In the last 4 years, we lost 25% of those doing children's legal aid. We lost 16% across the whole of the legal aid practitioners. And the profession, the solicitor's profession, is top heavy. There's way more over 50 than there are under 30, and we're not filling in the gap. So the most important thing, I think, is reinstate the traineeship fund. And next in order of priority, but very, very close behind it, is to get the system overhauled into a situation in which firms like Moir Sweeney can actually make a living and make it attractive, so that people coming out of university with their shiny diploma want to go to Moir Sweeney. They want to be the next Donald Finlay. They don't want to be the next Roddy Dunlop. They want to be the next Donald Finlay because they want to be in the criminal courts. They want the cut and thrust of that. And that's, it's a hugely fulfilling career. But my branch of the profession is almost entirely reliant on throughput from solicitors. Unlike in England, where you decide when you come out of university whether you're going to go to the bar or be a solicitor, 95% of members of faculty were solicitors first. And going back to what I said earlier, if you're training in a civil firm and you want to go to the bar, you're going to come to the bar and you're going to do civil work. You're not, very few people come to the bar and think, okay, well, I've got a civil career ahead of me, but actually I'm going to change and go into crime. It doesn't happen. We need people from the very moment they start their legal career being enthused by being criminal practitioners. And then, as Ian says, working their way up, having a successful career as a solicitor, if they want to, going to the bar, taking silk, being the next, Tony Lennon, the next Donald Finlay, and then going on the bench. That's the career progression we need to see, and we're not going to get it unless we act now.
Yeah. I'm taking a quote here that Justice Minister Eva Siobhan Brown has denied that legal aid in Scotland is in crisis and called on the lawyers and the representative bodies to get round the table with her to talk about the future. Sort of dumping it back on the lawyers as if it's their fault.
The lawyers have always been keen to negotiate. I think the issue is that some of the lawyers' organisations, and again, Ian will know this better than I do, are awaiting responses to correspondence issued several months ago to either the Minister or to her predecessor, perhaps. So the problem is not lawyers failing to negotiate or to address these issues. I think that the problem is that the government actually have not been listening for a very long time. There is another added issue that I'd like to touch on as a female, and that is to do with some statistics that tend to indicate that women lawyers who do legal aid work are dropping off at a higher rate now than men, particularly in civil work, certainly is what I see, but I think a similar position applies in crime. And I find that really quite upsetting in the days when we want to talk about equality of the sexes. Because when I started uni, there were far more men than women in the profession, and then that kind of turned on its head. But I think in a court context, we're going backwards, and there are going to be far fewer women in court, especially on legal aid, than there have been in recent years. And I think that needs to be addressed too. So it's not just about money, it's about organisation, it's about what kind of society do we want to be in? What do we want to see in the context of equality within the profession, across all different parts of the profession? And I think an area that we've not actually touched on very much is the huge disparity between jobs in civil and criminal defence and the incomes. I know Roddy touched on this earlier to a point, but the difference that there is in starting salaries, which then continues as you go further up the line. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, I think it was probably in the time of the pandemic, there was an advert online for lawyers to join the Scottish Government. I think it was 20 they were looking for, and the starting salary was £40,000. And that was a couple of years ago. I nearly fell off my chair. I thought it was a misprint, because the advert said that applied to any lawyer at any level, including those who had just left university, which meant they did not have a completed traineeship, and yet they could start with the Scottish Government on what in those days was roughly twice what you would be paid as a first-year trainee in private practice. So there are policy decisions that have been made by the government over a period of time which have boosted and promoted prospects within the public sector at the same time as prospects within the private sector have substantially diminished. These matters need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed by a minister who understands the nature of the problem. And I think that has not always been the case with some of the legal aid ministers that we've had in the recent past.
I was just reading a statistic here, Ian, that correct me if I'm wrong in it, but there are currently apparently 911 solicitors in Scotland on the Scottish Legal Aid Board's criminal register. But the number of solicitors over the age of 50 outnumber those under 30 by a ratio of 2 to 1. So maybe 10, 12, 15 years down the road, it is going to be catastrophic.
Yeah, and we're already seeing a lot of very experienced lawyers either retiring due to the stress of it or because they've reached retirement age, or in a lot of cases well beyond. There are solicitors appearing regularly in Glasgow Sheriff Court who are way into their 70s and some in their 80s, who are included in those figures. So that's where I find statistics like that frustrating when we're trying to explain to the government the reality of the situation. Many of that 900 will do very little criminal legal aid. They'll be registered for it to cover for holidays for colleagues, or they're focusing on something else, but they'll help out as required within a firm. So there's a lot less lawyers than that specialising, and increasingly the process of being involved in defending a criminal case is more and more and more complex. It never gets more simple. It's always becoming more complex. The 1995 Act is about 3 or 4 times as thick now as it was when it first came out, with all the Section 204 ZX, A, B, and so on that have been inserted, all of which create time limits that are increasingly difficult to stick to because, as Eva said, it's difficult for many firms to have enough admin support and enough solicitors. So you're under increased pressure trying to make the system work. And as that pressure grows on those that are left, they're likely to become unwell through stress or whatever. And just going on to the point about what the minister said recently about lawyers need to get round the table, let me be absolutely clear about this. I've been involved in negotiating with the government for well over a decade now, and the only time that we have walked away from something, for want of a better phrase, was against this background. There was a working group set up in, I think, 2018, which was off the back of the Evans review, which had taken years to get to the point of suggesting setting that group up. One of the things that looked as if it was fairly non-controversial from an early stage was that once we get appropriate rates set for legal aid, it would be really good if we had a mechanism such as retail price index or whatever government driver that would allow the fees to increase year on year, keeping pace with inflation, etc., so that rather than arguing about money all the time, everyone could be round the table working together to improve the justice system in Scotland, which is where we want to be. What then happened was another working group was set up with a view to deciding which driver should be used. Now, there are loads of them. You would imagine they could simply say, we will use this particular one. But they set up a working group, and almost 2 years down the line, they still hadn't even found somebody to instruct to do the research for it. And we were advised that even if we get such a mechanism, there is no money, so it'll be academic because there's no guarantee that we would give you the money, even if that was recommended or required by the mechanism. That was the point at which we saw that there was little point in carrying on with that particular piece of work. But we made it plain that we were not walking away from speaking to the government. We were not walking away from speaking to the Legal Aid Board, and we continue to do so. There was one piece of work that was literally, it was becoming almost embarrassing hearing that yet again another few months have gone by and we don't have a person to take the tender to do this work to get us to the first base. So to suggest that we're unwilling to come to the table isn't true. We are and always have been at the table. There was one piece of work that we walked away from because we were so frustrated at the lack of progress.
And the other thing is, of course, and I speak as a layman, they keep creating new laws, which means they can make people, break the law. more work piling up. But the one thing, Roddy, lawyers are not organised workforce such they can't go on strike, or they have never chosen to go on strike. You know, how do you get the government to pay attention? I mean, as Ian's saying here, you're trying, you're talking, you're wanting to negotiate, but they don't seem to be paying attention. I say from looking in, what do you do to get it going?
Well, I think you're just picking up on the previous conversation about the current minister. I mean, I get on very well with Siobhan Brown. I like and respect Siobhan Brown, and I do think she is listening to our concerns. So I think what she needs to do is apply more pressure to those who hold the purse strings. I think she understands the concerns and the growing problems. But what needs to be done is more pressure needs to be applied on the people that are actually the bean counters in all of this. But you ask, how else do we bring about? I mean, you're right. Certainly, the bar has never gone on strike. We literally can't go on strike. We are bound by the cab rank rule, and so I can't envisage a situation in which we would. There has been Gowns Down. The campaign that was organised by the Scottish Solicitors Bar Association, in which there was effectively a strike or a withholding of work. And there have been situations in which, for example, in certain parts of the country, solicitors have said, look, we're not taking on domestic abuse cases anymore because they're really complicated. They are extremely expensive to run, but we get paid buttons for doing them, so we're not doing them anymore. Now, no lawyer wants to do that. That is not in our interest, not working, for all lawyers in one way or another are reliant on self-employed income because we're either self-employed or we're working for somebody who's self-employed. So not working doesn't help anyone. But I can see this getting worse if we don't address the problems. Gowns Down will happen again. Refusal to take on domestic abuse cases will happen again. And you add to that the burgeoning problem that we've got with well-being, because it's absolutely right. Now, I mean, I'm a workophile. I will quite happily, work until the wee small hours because I'm an anorak and I really love my job, and I get a kick out of it. Not everyone does, and many people are being forced to work incredibly long hours without getting paid for it in incredibly stressful situations. And that is going to create a real well-being problem. We've already seen real problems with well-being in the profession, sometimes catastrophic results. And if we don't address this, that is going to get worse as well.
Eva, it's a society that doesn't have law and justice is a bad society. Now, doctors and nurses, the NHS staff, even binmen get more sympathy than lawyers, don't they? And that is part of the problem. As someone alluded to at the beginning, everyone seems to think you're all multi-millionaires and you're swimming in money, when it's actually not true. There's not a sympathetic public behind the lawyers either, is there?
No, there's not, until they need a lawyer themselves and they find they can't get one. So, as I've said before, it's not the first time that we've had folk contacting us from saying that we're maybe the 30th firm that they've tried and they're at the end of their tether because they've just run out of places to go. But no, there isn't sympathy for lawyers. But, I make no bones about it. I've made a good living out of the law, but I started work in 1980. If I was starting work now, doing the kind of work that I've done in the past few years, I would not be doing legal aid work. I'd be concentrating on a private practice. There'd be far fewer hours in my working day, and the bottom line at the end of each year would be a lot more healthy than it has been in recent years. And that's just reality. So I think that the general public, particularly those who don't have the money to pay lawyers privately, really need to pay attention to what's going on here, because what is happening is that we will get into that set of circumstance where, Roddy says we've not really been before about the poor having no lawyers. There are areas of Scotland where the poor currently have no lawyers. We've said this already. There are legal aid deserts in parts of Scotland, and that's just plain wrong. So it needs more than lawyers to be agitating about this. It needs those clients of yesteryear or those people who might be clients next week to take notice and understand that there is a dreadful erosion of a public service going on here with the repeated constant failure to address this need. It's an unmet need which is growing almost exponentially because of the people that are either already left from the profession or are about to leave. I mean, I can name several friends only in central Scotland who stopped doing civil and children's legal aid work in the course of the past couple of years, particularly since the pandemic. That's only going to get worse if things are not addressed radically, dramatically, and very quickly. What's not needed is another working group or another working party. What's needed is substantive, cogent, robust action that takes into account all the subjects that we've spoken about today and the impact on society, because quite frankly, it's going to cost the Scottish Government a lot more money across different budgets if they don't address this holistically and with an eye to the bigger picture.
Yeah, when Roddy said earlier about £1 and gets you 8.32 back, I don't understand why the government, any governments do not jump on this to do it. But Ian, we've been very negative here. Can you see any light, anything that's giving you a bit of hope that things might be about to change?
I'm at heart an optimist, but I am finding it extremely difficult to be in any way optimistic given the amount of years that have passed where we've been warning that we would end up where we are, and nothing has hit home to the government to realise that the longer you delay in fixing this and investing, the problem may not even be fixable. And if it is, it's going to cost you so much more money than if you would just take action now and invest in the trainee fund, as Roddy said. I view that as absolutely critical. If this can be fixed, it can only be fixed with a trainee fund every year for a number of years, so that the 40 that come in, not every one of them will stay in legal aid. That's just the reality, because there are other options for their career. It may not be for them. Court work isn't easy. It's not for everybody. I have a friend who did one court appearance in his traineeship and swore he would never appear in a court again, and he hasn't. He's had a very successful career, but it wasn't for him. So you're not going to get all 40 to stay. Like anything else in life, you won't have 100% retention, but we need to have that year on year on year. And those people then need to be able to see that whether it's in my firm or a smaller firm, that I can become an associate, I can become a partner. And if I become a partner, I'm not going to be worse off than somebody who doesn't have all those additional stresses and worries. You know, running any business isn't straightforward. There's always difficulties. You need the time to be able to deal with them. You need the money to be able to fix it. When your rent goes up by 50% unexpectedly, you know, these are the sort of things that you need to have realistic money for. And it's, I think, often conflated that, oh, you know, you get £50 an hour or whatever for legal aid. That is the money on which you run a firm. It's not the money that goes straight into a lawyer's pocket. That is used to pay for your heating, your lighting, your indemnity insurance, your rates, all of these things, staff costs, all of which go up and up and up. And in real terms, the legal aid fees are being devalued year on year on year. So they need to take action now, or it's just going to become ruinously expensive to fix, if it can be fixed at all.
Yeah, indeed, it sounds like it. What about you, Roddy? Do you see any light here? Do you see any way forward?
Well, I mean, I adverting to what I said earlier, I am very optimistic from my own side of the profession, because the bar has never been busier. It's never been more popular. We've got the biggest intake of devils this year we've had, I think, ever. That is in part driven by the fact that people are fleeing the solicitor side of the profession. We've got more than half of our devils this year are criminal practitioners. We've never had that before. Ordinarily, you maybe only get 25% of our devils will be criminal practitioners. To have more than half shows me that there's a lot of people who are thinking, do you know what? If I'm going to be a criminal lawyer, I'm going to be a criminal lawyer at the bar, because the future there is pretty rosy. So I'm optimistic from that point of view. I find it much more difficult to be optimistic when I look at my my colleagues in the solicitors profession and what they're going through, and I remind myself that faculty is entirely reliant on solicitors to provide the instructions. We don't go interviewing witnesses. We don't go finding clients. We're relying on instructions. If you don't have solicitors, you won't have instructions. And that's why it is, when I said earlier, there's no skin in the game, other than indirectly. It is very much in my interest to make sure the solicitors profession remains healthy and robust, and continues to be able to serve the people of Scotland by making sure that people have proper representation, including, where appropriate, by instructing counsel.
Eva, what can the general public do? I mean, there's only so much that the profession, they've tried, it seems, but the people watching this and their friends and neighbours, you say, if they're going to need a lawyer, they might one day need one, might not be one that they can afford. So what can the general public do? Write to the MSPs, their MPs? What can they do to help?
They should be complaining to their MSPs, and they should be pointing out how difficult it is to get a legal aid lawyer in places like Clackmannanshire or Orkney, Shetland, wherever it is. And I think that the wrath of the public may very well have a greater impact on politicians than does the managed anger of the legal profession itself. If you consider this set of circumstances, you're an anxious mother whose child's been referred to social work for some reason, and from there on to the children's panel. And at the moment, if you live in Clackmannanshire, there's 3 of us locally that you can phone for advice. Maybe none of us are able to help because we've been involved with your family before, or we act for your ex or something like that. So you then have to go to Stirling to try to find somebody there, but there's only a handful of legal aid lawyers there. You don't get anybody there. You try Falkirk. Now, I think in Falkirk, there's possibly one full-time civil legal aid practitioner and a couple who do the work on a kind of part-time basis with split practice, but you very quickly can run out of options, even in a place like Forth Valley. So this is a developing difficulty that the public cannot fail to be aware of. We know this from the numbers that are coming to us, and we're a one-woman band. I operate from what was a former public toilet, so we're not exactly talking Lincoln lawyer material here. There is another nickname for our office, but in the real world, people need to know that there are high street lawyers in rural areas as well as in towns and cities. The high street lawyer is going to become a thing of the past unless the public value what is currently available and point out to their politicians that they need this to be saved. When I came back to open the office that I have now in Alva, which was 2014, there were people saying locally, oh, look, we've got a lawyer back in the town again. They were pleased. Now, they've not all come to me for advice by any stretch of the imagination. Of course they haven't. But it was good for the high street. It was good for the town. It was an empty lot that was being opened and being filled again. My old office in Stirling has been converted back into flats for families to live in. A previous office that I had in Alloa is currently empty. That position will be replicated right across the whole country, where folk will be saying, oh, that used to be the lawyer, but they're not there now. That's the problem that we've got, and it needs to be addressed. I mean, I know there are several places in Glasgow, for example, because I've passed through them, particularly in the East End, where you see former solicitors' offices that are now closed. And I can't understand how we got to this, because we need more lawyers, more solicitors now than ever, because of, as you've already said, there are more laws. There are more people needing legal advice, but they're not getting it because the government's getting it wrong.
It is. Well, I'm afraid to say the clock is beating us. I've got to say this has been a surreal experience where I've been questioning the lawyers. And as I said at the beginning now, because I've been getting some advice on this show, I don't want a fee note from any of you, because I take it was all volunteered evidence. But can I thank you, Eva, and can I thank you, Ian, can I thank you, Roddy, for taking time out of your busy schedules as you've shown us today. And I hope in some way, with maybe some help from the public, that we can help a little bit and try and move this forward. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much.
And to you at home, folks, till we see you again, you and yours, take care.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.